The air inside Sotheby's auction house hung thick with perfume and anticipation on that April afternoon, shafts of spring sunlight slanting through tall windows to illuminate the assembled crowd of London's finest. Eleanor Ashworth stood near the back of the room, her dark, violet mourning dress marking her as a woman still honoring her father's memory. 6 months after his passing. She knew she should not be here, that the coins carefully hoarded in her reticule represented funds desperately needed for a dozen other purposes, but when she had seen the listing in the Times, her heart had seized with such fierce longing that reason abandoned her entirely. The silver music box with its engraved nightingale had belonged to her grandmother, sold years ago when her father first began his slide into debt, and Eleanor had listened to its melody as a child, winding it each morning in her grandmother's sitting room at Ashworth Hall. Now she had one chance to reclaim it, to bring home this one small piece of her family's former prosperity. The auctioneer's voice rang out across the assembled crowd, and Eleanor became suddenly aware of how little attention anyone paid her, how the fashionable ladies in their spring silks looked past her as though she were part of the furniture, their gazes dismissing a woman of 27 with unremarkable features and no fortune to recommend her. She had grown accustomed to invisibility in the years since she might have been considered marriageable, but today it served her purpose well, allowing her to observe without being observed. The music box appeared on the platform, catching the light, and Eleanor's breath caught at the sight of the nightingale's delicate engraving, exactly as she remembered. The bidding opened at £10, and a gentleman near the front raised his hand with casual confidence. Eleanor recognized him by reputation, though they had never been introduced. Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Thornfield, known throughout society as a collector of rare objects and a man who always acquired what he desired. His dark hair and tall frame marked him even from a distance, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of absolute certainty, a man who had never been denied. Eleanor's heart hammered as she raised her own hand, bidding £12, and she saw the Duke glance back briefly, his expression registering momentary surprise before settling into dismissive amusement. The battle proceeded in increments, his hand rising with barely concealed impatience each time she countered his bid, until they reached £35, and the rest of the room fell silent, watching this peculiar contest between a duke and a nobody. Eleanor knew she had reached her limit, knew that the £40 in her reticule was meant for the household accounts. But when he bid £38, she heard herself call out 40 with a clarity that surprised her, and the auctioneer's gavel fell before the Duke of Thornfield could respond, his jaw clenching as he stared at her with eyes gone cold as winter frost. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Eleanor emerged from Sotheby's into the late afternoon light with the music box secured in her reticule, its weight against her hip both comfort and warning. The spring sunshine that had flooded the auction house windows now seemed diminished, clouds gathering at the edges of the sky in a way that made her think of storms approaching, and she clutched her shawl closer despite the relative warmth of the April air. Victory sang through her veins, even as unease coiled in her stomach, for she was not naive about what she had done or whom she had humiliated. A duke, she thought, her triumph already tarnishing. She had outbid a duke in front of half of London society, and men of his station did not forgive such public defeats, regardless of how small the stakes might seem to their vast fortunes. Behind her she heard the murmur of voices spilling from the auction house entrance, and she caught fragments of conversation that made her steps falter. That was Eleanor Ashworth, someone said, the name carrying clearly across the pavement. Thomas Ashworth's daughter, the one whose father died last autumn, leaving nothing but debts. I heard Ashworth Hall is mortgaged to the hilt. Whatever possessed her to challenge Thornfield over a trinket when her family can barely keep their estate staffed? Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept walking, refusing to show that she had heard. And then a voice cut through the chatter with cold precision. "Miss Ashworth." She turned to find the Duke of Thornfield standing 5 paces behind her, tall and imposing in the fading light, his jaw clenched in that way she had noticed during their bidding war. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying with a composure she did not feel, very aware of the audience gathering along the street to witness this encounter. He moved closer, and she saw his grey eyes were chips of ice, his scar catching the light as his left hand flexed at his side. "I congratulate you on your acquisition," he said, each word precisely enunciated. "It is not often that I am outmaneuvered." Eleanor heard the threat beneath the courtesy, the promise of retribution wrapped in gentleman's language. "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, matching his formality. "The item held sentimental value for my family." His smile did not reach his eyes. "Sentiment is a luxury, Miss Ashworth. I wonder that you indulge it given your circumstances." The cut was deliberate and public, meant to remind her of her reduced position. And Eleanor felt anger kindle beneath her fear. "Some things are worth more than their price, Your Grace. Some of us measure value differently than by acquisition alone." She saw his eyes narrow, surprised perhaps by her refusal to be cowed, and then Caroline Langley appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd, her beautiful face alight with malicious interest. Eleanor knew the gossip would be all over London by evening, the story of the impoverished spinster who dared challenge a duke and then spoke to him with unseemly boldness. Alexander Pembroke stepped back, executing a bow that was technically correct but held no warmth. "Good day, Miss Ashworth. I am certain we shall not meet again." But his jaw remained clenched as he turned away, and Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that this was not finished, that she had made an enemy who possessed both the pride and the resources to exact whatever revenge his wounded dignity demanded. Ashworth Hall stood elegant and defiant in the morning light. 3 days after the auction, its Elizabethan stonework glowing golden where the sun touched the western face, though Eleanor knew that closer inspection would reveal the crumbling mortar in the east wing and the missing tiles on the stable roof that they could not afford to replace. She stood in her sitting room on the 2nd floor, the chamber that had been hers since childhood, and wound the music box with careful reverence, listening to the nightingale's melody fill the space with its sweet, melancholy tune. The sound carried her back to her grandmother's time, to an era when the Ashworth name had meant something beyond debt and diminishment, and she allowed herself this one moment of pure sentiment before the day's responsibilities claimed her attention. Below in the gardens she could see the roses beginning their spring bloom, the bushes her mother tended with devoted care despite her increasing frailty, and beyond them the 200 acres of parkland that had belonged to her family for 8 generations now hung over them like a beautiful weight they could no longer carry. The staff had been reduced from 20 to 8 over the past 2 years, and those who remained stayed more from loyalty than adequate compensation. Their wages often delayed, while Eleanor juggled accounts and tried to stretch inadequate funds across impossible distances. Her father's death 6 months prior had revealed the true extent of his financial failures. The years of poor investments and aristocratic pride that had prevented him from economizing when such measures might have saved them. And now Eleanor carried the burden of his legacy, while trying to shield her mother from the worst of their circumstances. Lady Margaret Ashworth had been fragile even before her husband's passing, and the shock of widowhood had left her increasingly vague and dependent, so that Eleanor found herself responsible not only for the estate's management, but for her mother's care and emotional protection. She heard footsteps in the hallway, and turned from the window as their housekeeper Mrs. Davies appeared in the doorway, her expression troubled in a way that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with familiar dread. "Mr. Fairfax has arrived, Miss Eleanor," the housekeeper said quietly. "He asked to speak with you in the library immediately. He says it is a matter of greatest urgency." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she closed the music box, its melody fading to silence, but her voice remained steady when she replied that she would attend him directly, and she took a moment to smooth her simple morning dress and compose her features before descending the stairs. Robert Fairfax had served her family for 30 years, managing their legal affairs with patient discretion, and he was not a man given to dramatics or unnecessary alarm, which meant that whatever had brought him to Ashworth Hall unannounced on a Wednesday morning was serious enough to warrant immediate attention. She found him standing in the library among her father's books, his elderly frame upright, but his face grave in a way that made her heart hammer against her ribs. And when he turned to face her, she saw he carried a leather document case that he clutched as though it contained something toxic. "Miss Ashworth," Robert Fairfax began, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of professional discretion now strained by distress. "I am afraid I bring news of the gravest nature regarding the mortgage held by Threadneedle Bank on Ashworth Hall." Eleanor felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet, but she moved to the desk with steady steps, gesturing for him to continue, while her hands gripped the back of her father's chair hard enough that her knuckles whitened. "The mortgage has been purchased," he said, withdrawing documents from his case with hands that trembled slightly. "Purchased," Eleanor repeated, the word not quite making sense, for she had been negotiating with the bank for months on a payment schedule they had tentatively agreed to consider. By whom? But even as she asked, she felt cold certainty spreading through her chest, a knowledge that arrived ahead of his answer. "The Duke of Thornfield acquired the note 2 days ago," Mr. Fairfax said quietly, and his grey eyes held pity that made her want to scream. "He has exercised his legal right to call in the full amount, which, as you know, stands at £8,000, including accumulated interest. The sum was impossible, a figure so far beyond their means that Eleanor had never even conceived of paying it in full, and she heard herself ask in a voice that sounded distant and strange when they must vacate the property. June 17th, Mr. Fairfax replied, placing the documents on the desk where she could see the official seals and the bold signature that read, "Alexander Pembroke," in black ink that seemed to burn against the pale paper. 60 days from the date of purchase. That is the term he has specified. Eleanor stared at the signature and understood with perfect clarity that this was her punishment for the music box, for the public humiliation she had dealt him at Sotheby's, and the deliberate cruelty of it took her breath away even as a part of her recognized she had known this was coming from the moment their eyes met outside the auction house. "Mr. Fairfax," she said carefully, "is there any legal recourse, any means to contest this action?" He shook his head with profound regret. "The Duke's position is unassailable, Miss Ashworth. The mortgage was in arrears. The bank had every right to sell the note, and the new holder has every right to demand immediate payment or possession. I have examined every possible avenue, and there is simply no legal remedy available to us." Behind Eleanor, the library door opened, and Lady Margaret appeared, her vague blue eyes sharpening with alarm as she took in the scene before her. "Eleanor, what is happening?" her mother asked in the high, anxious voice that had become habitual since her husband's death. "Why does Mr. Fairfax look so distressed?" Eleanor turned and summoned a smile that felt like glass cutting her face, moving to take her mother's hands in her own, even though her own hands shook with fury and shock. "It is a minor complication with the estate accounts, Mamma," she said gently. "Nothing that cannot be managed. Please return to your sitting room, and I will join you shortly to explain everything." Lady Margaret looked between them uncertainly, but allowed herself to be guided back into the hallway, and Eleanor waited until her mother's footsteps faded before returning to face Robert Fairfax, with her composure held together by pure will. "I must go to London," she said quietly, and the elderly solicitor nodded, though his expression suggested he held little hope that any appeal to the Duke of Thornfield would prove successful. Eleanor travelled to London alone on April 20th, taking the early morning coach and arriving at Pembroke House by late morning, with her heart hammering against her ribs and her best day dress of deep blue muslin feeling inadequate the moment she stepped onto the marble steps of the Duke's London residence. The building rose before her like a monument to wealth and power, its Portland stone facade gleaming white in the spring sunlight, its windows reflecting the sky in a way that made the structure seem less like a home and more like a fortress designed to intimidate anyone who approached its doors. She had sent no word ahead of her arrival, knowing that any request for an audience would likely be denied, and so she simply presented herself to the butler who answered her knock with an expression of such practiced hauteur that she understood immediately how the Duke's household reflected his character in every detail. "Miss Eleanor Ashworth to see the Duke of Thornfield on a matter of urgent business," she said with as much composure as she could summon. And she saw the butler's eyes travel over her unfashionable dress and unaccompanied state, with an assessment that found her wanting in every particular. "The Duke was not expecting callers," the butler began, but Eleanor interrupted with a firmness that surprised them both. "Please inform His Grace that I will wait as long as necessary," she said quietly. "This concerns the Ashworth estate, and I believe he will wish to address the matter personally." The butler's expression shifted almost imperceptibly towards something that might have been respect or might simply have been curiosity, and he admitted her to a receiving room off the main hall where she stood among furniture that cost more than her family's annual income, and tried to steady her breathing while her hands clutched her reticule with enough force that she could feel the outline of the music box still nestled inside. She waited for 20 minutes that felt like hours, using the time to rehearse the logical arguments she had prepared during the sleepless night before, reminding herself that she must appeal to reason rather than mercy, because men like Alexander Pembroke did not respond to pleas for compassion, but might be swayed by proposals that served their interests. When the door finally opened and he entered the room, she was struck again by the physical presence of him, the way he seemed to fill the space with an authority that was as much about bearing as about actual size. He was tall and dark-haired with grey eyes that fixed on her with an expression of surprise that quickly shifted to something harder and more guarded, and she noticed the scar on his left hand as he closed the door behind him with deliberate precision. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice carried the same cold courtesy she remembered from their brief exchange outside Sotheby's. "This is unexpected." She lifted her chin and met his gaze directly despite the trembling in her legs. "Your Grace, I have come to discuss the terms of the Ashworth Hall mortgage and to propose an alternative arrangement that might serve us both more favourably than the current situation." Alexander gestured toward the library with a coldness that suggested he was granting this audience purely as a formality, and Eleanor followed him through corridors lined with portraits of Pembroke ancestors, whose painted eyes seemed to judge her presumption in entering these halls. The library was everything she had imagined, and more, a cathedral of learning that rose 2 stories high, with galleries accessed by spiral staircases and walls covered floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes whose spines glowed in shades of burgundy and forest green and midnight blue under the light streaming through tall windows. There were perhaps 1,000 books, she estimated at a glance. Maybe more. And despite her anxiety, she felt her breath catch at the sheer magnificence of the collection, even as she noticed the disorganization that suggested these volumes had been inherited rather than personally curated. Alexander stood near a massive desk of carved walnut and crossed his arms in a posture that radiated skepticism as he waited for her to speak, and Eleanor forced herself to abandon the emotional plea she had half prepared, and instead adopt the tone she would use to discuss crop rotation with the estate steward. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I understand that you hold the Ashworth mortgage and are within your legal rights to demand immediate payment or possession of the property. I am not here to dispute your position or to beg for mercy. I have no reason to expect. Instead, I wish to propose an arrangement that might benefit us both." She saw his eyebrow lift fractionally in surprise and pressed forward before he could interrupt. "I observed as I entered that your library, magnificent as it is, lacks a proper cataloguing system. The volumes appear to be shelved without consistent organization, and I would wager that locating specific titles or authors requires considerable time and effort." Alexander's jaw tightened in that way she recognized from Sotheby's, and she knew her guess had struck home. "I have spent the last 5 years managing my father's library and estate records," Eleanor continued, meeting his grey eyes directly. "I read Latin and French. I am familiar with bibliographic principles, and I am capable of creating a comprehensive catalogue that would include author, title, publication date, condition assessment, and provenance where known. In exchange for my services, I ask only that you extend the deadline for vacating Ashworth Hall by 3 months, which would give my mother and me time to make proper arrangements and perhaps secure alternative housing that would not require such precipitous displacement." She watched him process this unexpected proposal and saw the moment his expression shifted from cold dismissal to something more complex, a mixture of irritation and reluctant interest that suggested she had caught him off guard. "Why should I agree to this?" he asked finally, and his voice carried less ice than before, though it remained distant and formal. "What assurance do I have that you possess the competence you claim, or that 3 months will materially change your situation?" Eleanor lifted her chin and held his gaze with a directness that would have been considered bold in a ballroom, but felt necessary here in this negotiation that held her entire future in balance. "You have no assurance except my word, Your Grace, and I have no guarantee except your honor that you will uphold any agreement we make. But I can demonstrate my capabilities immediately if you permit me to examine a section of your collection, and as for whether 3 months will change our situation, that is my concern rather than yours. What I offer is skilled labor in exchange for time, a transaction no different than any other business arrangement between parties of unequal position." She saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been respect or might simply have been amusement at her audacity, and after a long moment during which she felt her heart hammering against her ribs, he moved to one of the shelves and withdrew a leather volume whose binding showed signs of age and careful handling. "Tell me about this," he said. Eleanor arrived at Pembroke House on the morning of April the 23rd with a leather satchel containing the notebooks and pencils she would need for cataloguing, and a determination to treat this arrangement as purely a business transaction, despite the way her pulse quickened as she climbed the marble steps for the second time in 3 days. The butler admitted her with slightly less hauteur than before and directed her to the library, where she found Alexander already waiting beside one of the tall windows with his arms crossed and an expression that suggested he was still uncertain whether this arrangement was inspired or merely foolish. "Miss Ashworth," he said with a formality that matched her own careful courtesy, "I trust you are prepared to demonstrate the competence you assured me you possess." She met his grey eyes directly and inclined her head in acknowledgement before moving to the nearest shelf and beginning her examination of the volumes with a focus that allowed her to ignore his presence, even as she remained aptly aware of his gaze following her movements. Her system was methodical and thorough. born from 5 years of managing her father's more modest but well-organized collection, and she began by grouping the books alphabetically by author, while making notes about condition and any distinguishing features that might affect value or require special handling. The first volume she catalogued in detail was an illuminated medieval manuscript whose vellum pages showed the jewel-bright colors of a text that had survived centuries of handling, and she found herself momentarily forgetting her audience as she traced the elaborate initial letters with a fingertip that stopped just short of touching the delicate surface. "This is 14th century French," she murmured, more to herself than to Alexander, and the illuminations suggest it was produced in a monastery scriptorium, probably for a wealthy patron given the quality of the gold leaf and the lapis lazuli used for the blue pigments. She made careful notes about the binding and the condition of the pages before looking up to find Alexander watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something between surprise and a reluctant fascination that made her suddenly self-conscious about her enthusiasm. "You know a great deal about manuscripts," he observed, moving closer to examine the volume she had described, and his tone carried less skepticism than genuine curiosity. "My father believed that understanding the provenance and creation of books made one a better reader," Eleanor replied, carefully closing the manuscript and returning it to its place before selecting the next volume for examination. "He taught me that every book has a history beyond its contents, a story of how it came into the world and survived to reach our hands." She saw something shift in Alexander's expression at these words, a softening around his eyes that suggested she had unexpectedly touched something in him that responded to her reverence for these objects that filled his library. The morning passed in a rhythm of examination and notation, punctuated by occasional questions from Alexander about her methods or observations about particular volumes, and Eleanor found herself relaxing incrementally as the work absorbed her attention, and the strange intimacy of shared passion for books created a temporary bridge across the chasm of their opposing positions. When the clock struck 2 and she prepared to depart, Alexander informed her that tea would be provided during future sessions and that his study door would remain open should she require access to reference materials he kept there, and Eleanor understood that he intended to observe her work, even as he framed his presence as offering assistance rather than surveillance. By the afternoon of May 5th, which marked the 12th day of their arrangement, the library had begun to feel less like a battlefield and more like a shared sanctuary, where Eleanor found herself arriving with an anticipation she refused to examine too closely, even as she catalogued it alongside the growing number of volumes she had processed. She had reached 200 books by her count, organized now in a system that brought order to the magnificent chaos Alexander had inherited, and she noticed that he had taken to spending more time in the library itself rather than merely observing from his adjacent study, often settling into one of the leather chairs with papers he claimed required his attention, but which seemed to receive less focus than the conversations that had begun to punctuate her work with increasing frequency. On this particular Thursday, the spring sunshine filled the tall windows with golden light that made the leather bindings glow like jewels, and Eleanor was examining a collection of modern poetry when Alexander remarked that he found most contemporary verse too concerned with emotion and not enough with craft, a pronouncement that made her look up from her cataloging with an expression of such genuine disagreement that he smiled for the first time in her presence. "You disapprove," he observed, setting aside the papers that had received only cursory attention, and Eleanor found herself responding with less caution than she would have permitted even a week earlier. "I think emotion and craft are not opposing forces, but rather partners in creation," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that came from years of reading poetry in her father's library, when the weight of responsibility grew too heavy. "Lord Byron's work may scandalize society, but his technical skill is undeniable, and the passion in his verses gives them a power that purely intellectual exercise cannot achieve. She saw Alexander's eyebrows rise in surprise, and realized she had quoted Byron, that most controversial of poets whose personal life made him unwelcome in respectable drawing rooms, even as his work was read in secret by half the ladies of the ton. "You read Byron," Alexander said, and his tone carried not censure, but a fascination that made her suddenly aware of how thoroughly she had abandoned the careful neutrality she had maintained during their earlier sessions. "My father believed that understanding literature required engaging with all its forms," Eleanor replied, feeling warmth rise in her cheeks, but refusing to retreat from her position, including those that challenge conventional thinking and provoke strong feeling rather than comfortable complacency. The silence that followed held a quality different from the antagonism of their first meetings, something charged with a recognition that they had moved beyond the formal boundaries of employer and hired cataloguer into territory neither had anticipated, and when Alexander rose from his chair and crossed to the shelf where she stood, Eleanor found her breath catching as he reached past her to withdraw a slim volume whose burgundy binding she recognized even before he opened it to a marked page. "Then you will appreciate this," he said, and began to read in a voice that transformed Byron's words about beauty walking in the night into something intimate and personal that seemed to fill the space between them with unspoken meaning. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a dangerous softening toward this man who still held her future in his hands, but who looked at her in this moment not as an adversary or even as an employee, but as someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered, whose presence had become something he sought rather than merely tolerated. And when he finished reading and their eyes met, she found herself smiling despite every reason for caution. "That is beautiful," she admitted quietly, and Alexander's answering expression held a warmth that made her realize how lonely he must be in this grand house, filled with inherited treasures, but empty of genuine companionship. And for the first time since entering his employment, she heard herself laugh at something he said about scholarly disputes over meter and rhyme, the sound surprising them both with its unguarded spontaneity as a servant entered with tea that Alexander had ordered without asking, a ritual that had established itself so gradually she had not noticed when his hospitality had shifted from grudging necessity to genuine welcome. The morning of May 14th brought with it a visitor Alexander had not expected, and would have refused had his butler consulted him before admitting Caroline Langley to the drawing-room, where she arranged herself on a settee with the kind of calculated grace that suggested she had practiced the pose before multiple mirrors. She was beautiful in the way society approved, with golden hair dressed in the latest fashion and a morning gown of pale blue muslin that emphasized her delicate figure. And Alexander found himself making the comparison he had trained himself not to make between this woman who represented everything his world valued and the one who had been occupying his thoughts with increasing frequency, despite possessing none of Caroline's obvious attractions. "Your Grace," Caroline began with a smile that showed her perfect teeth, "I confess I come partly from curiosity, for all of London is talking about your peculiar arrangement with Miss Ashworth, and I thought perhaps, as an old friend, I might offer some observations that others are too timid to share." Alexander felt his jaw tighten in the way it always did when his temper rose, but years of aristocratic training kept his voice level as he invited her to speak plainly, though he suspected he would not appreciate whatever frankness she offered. Caroline's laugh was musical and cruel in equal measure, as she remarked that it was all very charitable of him to provide employment to poor Eleanor, who had been on the shelf for so many years that everyone had quite given up on her making any respectable match, though of course with her lack of beauty and fortune no one had expected much to begin with. And was it not fortunate that she at least possessed some education to make herself useful in service? Alexander discovered in that moment something about himself he had not fully recognized until Caroline's words crystallized his feelings into sharp clarity, which was that hearing Eleanor described in such dismissive terms made him angrier than he could remember being since the auction house humiliation that had started this entire sequence of events, and he found himself speaking in a tone cold enough to make Caroline's smile falter. "Miss Ashworth," he said with a precision that cut like a blade, "possesses more genuine intelligence and character than most of the women society celebrates for superficial attributes, and I consider her company a privilege rather than a charity, which is more than I can say for this conversation." He saw Caroline's eyes widen in surprise, and something that might have been calculation as she reassessed whatever strategy had brought her to his door, and she recovered her composure enough to suggest with artificial sweetness that she hoped his admiration for the poor spinster's mind did not lead him into any imprudent decisions that might damage his standing among his equals. The interview ended shortly thereafter, with Caroline departing in a rustle of expensive muslin and barely concealed irritation, and Alexander stood at the window watching her carriage disappear down the street while he examined the fierceness of his reaction and understood with uncomfortable clarity that he had just defended Eleanor not from duty or fairness, but from something far more dangerous that he was not yet ready to name. He was still standing there 10 minutes later when his butler announced Miss Ashworth's arrival, and Alexander turned to see Eleanor entering the hall just as Caroline's carriage rounded the far corner, and the expression on Eleanor's face as she glanced toward the departing vehicle told him she had seen his previous visitor and drawn conclusions that made her greet him with a formality that felt like a door closing between them. The afternoon of May 18th arrived under skies heavy with clouds that had been gathering since morning, and Eleanor felt the approaching storm in the oppressive weight of the air as she worked through a section of 18th-century histories, whose careful documentation of battles and treaties seemed to mock her with their concern for events already safely resolved, while her own future remained precarious and unsettled. She had been maintaining careful distance from Alexander for the past 4 days since witnessing Caroline Langley's departure, and though she had not heard the conversation between them, she had seen enough in Caroline's satisfied expression and Alexander's tense posture to convince herself that she had been foolish to imagine the warmth between them meant anything beyond a duke's idle amusement with a woman so far beneath his station that even entertaining serious regard for her would be laughable. Alexander had noticed her withdrawal, and his frustration with it had become increasingly evident in the way he found reasons to interrupt her work with questions that seemed designed less to gain information than to force her attention back to him. And when the first crack of thunder rattled the library windows, he appeared in the doorway with an expression of concern that Eleanor told herself was merely the courtesy any gentleman would show an employee caught in dangerous weather. The rain began as a whisper against the glass, and within minutes had become a deluge that turned the streets outside into rivers, and made clear that Eleanor's planned departure in 20 minutes would be impossible, and when Alexander suggested she wait in more comfortable surroundings until the storm passed, she heard herself agreeing with a stiffness that made his grey eyes narrow in that way she had learned meant he was working through a problem he could not quite solve. He led her not to one of the formal receiving rooms, but to a smaller sitting room she had not seen before. Clearly his private space rather than one designed for visitors, and the intimacy of the fire burning in the grate and the deep chairs positioned close to its warmth made her acutely aware of how far they had travelled from the formal antagonism of their first meetings into territory that felt dangerous precisely because it felt so natural. She was standing near the window watching water stream down the glass when Alexander's voice came from closer behind her than she had expected, asking with a directness that seemed born of exasperation why she had been avoiding him, and Eleanor felt something break inside her chest. The careful control she had maintained shattering under the weight of 4 days spent trying to protect herself from caring too much for a man who held every advantage over her, including the power to destroy what remained of her family's security. She turned to face him, and heard herself saying words she had not planned, admitting that she had seen Caroline leaving and understood that she should not have allowed herself to forget the vast distance between a duke and a woman like herself, that she had no business imagining their conversations meant anything beyond employer and employee, and she watched his expression shift from confusion to something that looked remarkably like hurt, before he spoke with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Whatever you think you understood about Caroline Langley's visit," he said, taking a step closer that brought him near enough that she could see the way the firelight caught in his dark hair. "You understood it wrongly, for I spent that entire conversation defending you against observations so cruel and dismissive that hearing them made me realize how thoroughly my feelings had changed from the revenge I once planned to something I had not intended and do not fully know how to name." The words hung between them in the firelit room, while thunder rolled overhead, and Eleanor felt the last of her careful walls crumbling as she recognized in his face an emotion that mirrored the dangerous hope rising in her own heart, despite every practical reason to guard against it. The storm had not abated by evening, and Eleanor found herself sitting across from Alexander at a small table in a dining room she suspected he rarely used, far more intimate than the formal hall such a house must possess, and the candlelight between them created an island of warmth against the darkness pressing at the windows, while servants brought courses that Eleanor barely tasted, because all her attention was consumed by the man watching her with an expression that seemed equal parts determination and vulnerability. She had expected awkwardness after the intensity of their earlier exchange, but Alexander had surprised her by suggesting they might share a meal while the storm continued, and something in the way he asked, without the automatic assumption of agreement she had once seen in his manner, made it impossible to refuse, even though every practical instinct warned her that she was venturing far beyond the safe boundaries of their already irregular arrangement. He began speaking as the first course was cleared, his voice lower than usual as he told her things she sensed he rarely shared, about parents who had died when he was 12 years old, leaving him to the guardianship of an uncle whose primary concern had been the ducal properties and income rather than the traumatized boy responsible for them, and about a younger sister named Elizabeth who had been his only real companion until fever took her when she was 16 and he was 20, leaving him alone in houses too large and a position too elevated for genuine friendship. Eleanor listened with her hands folded in her lap to keep them from reaching across the table toward him, and she understood suddenly why he had responded to her auction house victory with such disproportionate fury. For here was a man who had learned early that the world would give him everything except the few things he actually wanted, and her small defiance had struck at the pride that was his only reliable armor against isolation. When he finished speaking, the silence between them felt different than any that had come before, and Eleanor found herself telling him about her father, not the careful, sanitized version she offered in society, but the truth of how Thomas Ashworth had been a kind man and a terrible manager who had loved his family more than he loved careful accounting, and how his death had left her holding together an estate and a mother who had never been trained to face such realities, and how some nights she lay awake terrified that every decision she made was wrong and would lead to the final disaster she could not prevent. She watched Alexander's face as she spoke, and saw in his eyes a recognition that matched what she felt, the understanding of two people who had learned too young that they must be strong because no one else would be strong for them. And when he reached across the table to take her hand in his thumb tracing the callus on her finger from where she gripped her pen during long hours managing accounts, she did not pull away, even though the touch sent warmth flooding through her that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the grate. "Eleanor," he said, using her given name for the first time, and the sound of it in his voice made something in her chest constrict painfully. "I find myself in a position I did not anticipate, and am not certain I know how to navigate, for I began our acquaintance determined to punish you for a slight to my pride, and I discover now that what I feel has become something entirely different, something that makes me question every assumption I held about what I wanted from this life. She knew she should say something careful and self-protective, should remind them both of the vast distance between a duke and a woman with nothing to recommend her but education and determination. But instead, she tightened her fingers around his and admitted in a voice that trembled slightly that she too had found their arrangement becoming something she had not expected and did not know how to contain within the safe categories of employer and employee, creditor and debtor, duke and spinster cataloguing his books. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and the candles burned lower while they sat with hands joined across the table, and Eleanor felt as if she were standing at the edge of something that would either save or destroy her, knowing that, whichever it proved to be, she had already gone too far to turn back. The morning of May 19th arrived with sunlight so bright it seemed designed to mock the confusion of Eleanor's heart as she stood in the sitting room at Ashworth Hall, where the music box occupied its place of honour on the mantelpiece. Its silver surface catching the light while she wound the familiar mechanism and listened to the delicate melody that had once represented her only victory, but now felt tangled up with memories of candlelight and Alexander's hand warm around hers, and words that had been spoken with an intensity that still made her breath catch when she allowed herself to remember. She had returned home late the previous evening after the storm finally cleared, her mother already retired, and she had been grateful for the solitude that allowed her to avoid explaining the state of her emotions, or the fact that the Duke who held their fate in his hands had become something far more complicated than an adversary, or even an employer. Lady Margaret appeared in the doorway now, with an expression Eleanor knew meant maternal concern mixed with curiosity, asking if everything had proceeded normally with the cataloguing work yesterday, or if something had occurred to account for Eleanor's distraction at breakfast, and Eleanor felt guilt rise sharp and immediate because she had been so consumed with her own tangled feelings that she had nearly forgotten the practical reality that still hung over them, like the sword suspended by a thread in the ancient stories her father used to read aloud on winter evenings. She told her mother that the storm had merely delayed her return and turned the conversation toward estate business, reminding them both that Robert Fairfax was due to visit that afternoon with information about potential buyers for some of their furniture and artwork. And she watched her mother's face lose some of its animation at the reminder that they must continue preparing for a future that might not include this house where Margaret had been a bride at 19 and a mother at 20 and had spent 3 decades building a life that was now being carefully dismantled piece by piece. The letter arrived at midday with Robert himself, delivered with the apologetic air of a man who hated being the bearer of difficult news, but understood it was his duty to present all options clearly and without false comfort. And Eleanor read the careful script, explaining that a merchant family newly wealthy from trade contracts was interested in purchasing the contents of the main rooms for £800, a sum that seemed enormous until one remembered it represented less than 1/10 of what would be needed to satisfy the mortgage Alexander held. She found herself looking at the music box and calculating what it might bring at auction, knowing it was worth perhaps £40 or £50 to the right collector. But when she tried to imagine parting with it, she felt something twist painfully in her chest, because it had come to represent not just her grandmother's memory, but also the strange series of events that had brought Alexander into her life and transformed him from an enemy into something she did not have words to properly name. Through the window she could see the rose garden her mother tended with such devotion, the bushes heavy with blooms in shades of pink and cream and deep crimson, and the beauty of it seemed almost cruel when she knew they had only 4 weeks remaining before the June 17th deadline, 4 weeks that Alexander had not mentioned, and she had too much pride to raise, because she would not beg for rescue or assume that whatever was developing between them entitled her to expect salvation from a situation she had walked into with open eyes when she humiliated him at that auction house that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. The morning of May 23rd arrived with Eleanor feeling as though she were two different people inhabiting the same body. One who remembered candlelight and Alexander's voice speaking her name with a tenderness that still made her pulse quicken, and another who sat each evening with her mother reviewing which pieces of furniture might be sold, and which linens packed away, and which servants given notice with references that might help them find new positions before the final reckoning came on June 17th. And it was this second Eleanor who travelled to Pembroke House with her cataloguing materials and a determination to maintain the professional distance she had foolishly allowed to erode over recent weeks. She found Alexander waiting in the library, as had become his custom, though the door to his study stood open in a way that suggested he had been watching for her arrival. And when he greeted her with a warmth that seemed to expect reciprocation, she managed only a brief acknowledgement before turning to the shelves where 600 books now bore her careful notations, and 300 more waited to be examined and recorded in the leather ledger that represented both her salvation and her torment. He asked if something was troubling her, and she assured him that nothing beyond the usual challenges of deciphering poor handwriting in marginalia concerned her, a lie so transparent she was ashamed of it, even as the words left her mouth. But pride prevented her from admitting that she lay awake, calculating how many days remained before she would lose her home, while the man who held that power in his hands had apparently forgotten the timeline entirely in favor of poetry discussions and shared meals and moments of connection that felt precious and false in equal measure. Alexander moved closer as she worked, close enough that she could smell the soap he used and feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool library air. And he mentioned almost casually that the cataloguing project was progressing so well, he thought perhaps they might extend it beyond the original scope, perhaps include his collection at his country estate as well. And the suggestion hung in the air between them like an offer of something far more significant than additional bibliographic were. Eleanor felt something twist painfully in her chest because she understood he was trying to find reasons to keep her near him, ways to prolong an association that had become important to them both. But he seemed entirely unaware that in 3 weeks and 4 days his legal right to seize Ashworth Hall would make any question of future projects bitterly irrelevant unless he chose to address the matter directly, and her pride would not allow her to raise the subject herself, or beg for consideration, or assume that whatever tenderness had developed between them entitled her to expect rescue. She made an error in her cataloguing then, writing the wrong publication date for a volume she would normally have assessed correctly. And when Alexander noticed and gently corrected her, his hand brushed against hers on the page, and she pulled back as though burned, seeing hurt flash across his face before he mastered his expression into something more neutral. He had acquired something for her, he said quietly, producing a first edition she had mentioned admiring weeks ago, a volume she knew must have cost him considerable effort to locate, and she stared at the beautiful binding while trying to formulate words that would allow her to refuse, without revealing how much the gift meant or how terrified she was of accepting anything from him when their entire relationship existed in a space between what had been and what might never be, built on a foundation that would crumble completely when the deadline he had set, and apparently forgotten, finally arrived to render all of this painful tenderness into nothing more than a brief interlude before inevitable loss. The afternoon of May 27th found Alexander in his study, searching through correspondence files for a letter from his steward regarding the country estate, when his hand brushed against a folder he had not opened in weeks. a folder whose very existence he had somehow managed to bury beneath the accumulated business of running his holdings and the far more pleasant distraction of cataloguing sessions with Eleanor and conversations that had come to occupy his thoughts during every waking hour and most of his sleeping ones as well. He opened it without thinking, his mind still half occupied with the memory of how Eleanor had looked yesterday, when sunlight from the library windows had caught in her hair and turned it to shades of amber and gold. And then the date on the mortgage document seemed to leap from the page with the violence of a physical blow because it read June 17th, and his mind went blank for a moment before beginning to calculate, with the merciless precision of mathematics, that June 17th was exactly 3 weeks from today. 3 weeks during which he had been so consumed with his growing feelings for Eleanor and his delight in her company and his plans to find ways to extend their time together that he had completely forgotten the sword he had hung over her head in a moment of wounded pride that now seemed to belong to a different man entirely. He felt his hands begin to shake as he stared at his own bold signature on the document, the signature of the Duke of Thornfield, who had purchased this mortgage with the specific intention of making Eleanor Ashworth pay for the humiliation she had dealt him at an auction house, and the cruelty of it crashed over him like a wave of ice water, because Eleanor had known this entire time, had known during every conversation and every shared moment of laughter and every instant of growing closeness that he held the power to render her and her mother homeless, and she had never once mentioned it or begged for mercy or even hinted that the deadline approached with the inevitability of an executioner's blade. He remembered her distraction during their last session, the way she had seemed to withdraw just when he thought they were drawing closer, the hesitation with which she had accepted his gift, and understanding bloomed painful and complete, because of course she had been thinking of this deadline while he had been lost in romantic notions and plans for future projects. Of course she had been preparing for loss while he had been imagining ways to keep her near, and the contrast between his oblivious selfishness and her dignified silence made him feel shame so acute it was almost physical. He loved her, he realized with the clarity that comes from recognizing a truth that has been building for weeks without acknowledgement, loved her intelligence and her courage and her pride and the way she moved through the world with quiet grace despite society's dismissal, loved her enough that the thought of causing her pain was unbearable. And yet he had done exactly that through his own prideful vindictiveness, and then compounded the injury by forgetting the threat entirely, while she had carried the knowledge of it through every moment they spent together. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and began to pace the length of the study while his mind raced through options and possibilities, because simply cancelling the debt would not be enough, would not come close to making restitution for what he had done, and he needed to find a way to not just restore Ashworth Hall, but to demonstrate that he understood the magnitude of his cruelty, and that he recognized the extraordinary grace Eleanor had shown in maintaining her dignity and her kindness toward him, despite having every reason to hate him, with perfect justification. Alexander spent the hours until midnight pacing his study, and then moving restlessly through the library, where Eleanor's careful notations filled the ledger, and her presence seemed to linger in the very air. And by the time dawn broke pale and grey through the windows, he had formulated a plan that felt simultaneously insufficient to the magnitude of his wrongdoing, and yet the only possible path forward that might demonstrate the depth of his remorse and the sincerity of his transformed understanding. He would not simply cancel the mortgage debt, though that would be done immediately through Robert Fairfax with legal documents that returned full ownership of Ashworth Hall to the Ashworth family, free and clear of any encumbrance, and he would not simply apologize, though he would certainly do that as well if Eleanor ever granted him the opportunity to speak in his own defense, but rather he would undertake a complete restoration of the estate to the condition it had enjoyed before financial troubles had forced the family to reduce staff and allow the East Wing to fall into disrepair and sell off treasures like silver music boxes that carried the weight of memory and legacy. He summoned his steward at an hour far too early for polite society and began issuing instructions regarding contractors and craftsmen who could assess the necessary repairs. And he drafted a letter to his banker authorizing the establishment of an account in Lady Margaret Ashworth's name, with funds sufficient to maintain the estate in perpetuity, so that Eleanor would never again face the anxiety of unpaid mortgages or the humiliation of auctioning family possessions to meet basic obligations. And he pulled from his own collection several volumes he knew Eleanor had admired, and set them aside to be sent to Ashworth Hall as a gift that might demonstrate his attention to her interests and his respect for her scholarly mind. Yet even as he made these arrangements with the efficiency that came from years of managing vast holdings and complex business affairs, he recognized that material restitution alone could not address the true harm he had inflicted, which was not merely the threat of financial ruin, but the cruelty of having made Eleanor carry that threat in silence through weeks of growing intimacy, during which she had maintained her dignity and her kindness toward him, despite having every reason to despise him for his vindictive pride. He needed her to understand that he saw clearly now what he had been too blind and too arrogant to recognize at their first meeting, that worth had nothing to do with youth or conventional beauty or social standing, and everything to do with the qualities of character she possessed in abundance, the intelligence and courage and grace that made her more genuinely valuable than all the celebrated beauties of the ton who possessed nothing beneath their lovely facades except shallow ambition and petty spite. He would go to her today, he decided. As morning light strengthened and his servants began stirring in distant parts of the house, would travel to Ashworth Hall and lay before her both the legal documents that freed her from his threat and the confession of his feelings that would leave him vulnerable to the rejection he knew he deserved. And if she could not forgive him or return his regard, then at least she would know that one man had recognized her true worth and loved her, not despite society's dismissal of her, but because of the extraordinary person that dismissal had prevented others from taking the time to discover. The morning of May 29th dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline sunlight that made the English countryside look as though it had been painted by an artist with a particular fondness for spring greens and the soft gold of early flowers. And Alexander travelled the road to Ashworth Hall with his heart alternating between hope and dread, while the leather folder containing mortgage documents and bank authorizations sat beside him on the carriage seat like a talisman that might grant him salvation or merely serve as evidence of his own capacity for cruelty. He had sent no word ahead of his arrival because he feared that Eleanor might refuse to see him if given the opportunity to prepare, and as the carriage turned up the long drive toward the Elizabethan manor, he saw the estate properly for the first time, with eyes unclouded by vindictive satisfaction, saw the beauty of the old stone mellowed by centuries and the carefully tended rose gardens that spoke of loving attention despite limited resources, and the unfortunate state of the East Wing, whose crumbling facade nevertheless possessed a melancholy dignity that spoke to the family's determination to maintain standards even in the face of financial devastation. Eleanor was in the garden when he arrived, kneeling among the roses with dirt on her hands and a simple muslin dress that had been mended at the hem, and the sight of her there in the morning light surrounded by flowers, she had undoubtedly tended herself while carrying the knowledge that she might lose this place in a matter of weeks made something crack open in his chest with an almost physical pain. She looked up at the sound of carriage wheels on gravel, and he watched the progression of emotions across her face, surprise giving way to wariness, and then a careful blankness that told him she was preparing herself for some new cruelty. And he climbed down from the carriage, clutching the folder with hands that he realized were actually trembling, which was absurd for a duke, but entirely appropriate for a man who was about to lay his heart and his deepest regrets before a woman who had every reason to despise him. She rose slowly and brushed the dirt from her hands with movements that seemed deliberate and controlled, and when she spoke, her voice held the cool formality she had employed during their first meeting at Pembroke House before weeks of cataloguing and conversation had softened the distance between them. "Your Grace?" she said, and the title felt like a barrier being erected between them. "This is unexpected. I was not aware we had a session scheduled today." He moved toward her, carrying the folder and searching for words adequate to the magnitude of what he needed to say. And finally, he simply extended the documents toward her with hands that were definitely shaking now and said the only words that seemed to matter in this moment. "I have come to return what was always yours and to beg your forgiveness for having taken it in the first place." Eleanor stared at the leather folder he extended toward her, and for a long moment she could not seem to make her hands reach out to take it, because the simple act of accepting whatever documents it contained felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown air. And she was aware of the morning sun warm on her shoulders and the scent of roses drifting from the bushes behind her, and the way Alexander stood before her looking nothing like the cold aristocrat who had refused her plea in his London townhouse, but rather like a man who had not slept, and whose carefully maintained armor of ducal superiority had cracked open to reveal something raw and uncertain beneath. She finally took the folder with fingers that left small smudges of garden dirt on the pale leather, and opened it to find legal documents dense with formal language that her mind initially could not pass, because she was too aware of Alexander watching her with an intensity that made her skin feel warm despite the relative coolness of the morning air. But gradually the words resolved into meaning, and she found herself reading the same lines over and over as if repetition might make them more believable. The mortgage was cancelled, marked satisfied in full, with notations indicating that Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Thornfield, had paid the entire sum to the bank, and that Ashworth Hall was restored to Ashworth family ownership, free of any encumbrance or debt, and beneath that document was another establishing an account with sufficient funds to maintain the estate and repair the east wing and restore the staff to its former size. And beneath that was a letter of instruction to contractors detailing restoration work to begin immediately if Lady Margaret and Miss Eleanor Ashworth consented to accept this attempt at restitution for harm caused by the undersigned in a moment of prideful vindictiveness that he now recognized as unconscionable. Her eyes blurred, and she realized with some surprise that tears were sliding down her cheeks, though she could not recall beginning to cry. And when she looked up at Alexander, his expression held such obvious fear and hope mingled together that she understood this was not merely a financial transaction, but rather an offering of something far more valuable and far more fragile. "You remembered," she said, and her voice came out rough and unsteady. "The deadline. I thought perhaps you had forgotten entirely, given how you spoke of extending the cataloguing project, and how you seemed to believe we had all the time in the world to debate poetry and discuss medieval manuscripts, while I was counting days until my mother and I would be turned out of the only home we have ever known." He flinched as though she had struck him, and took a half-step forward before stopping himself, and his hands flexed at his sides with visible tension. "I did forget," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "I forgot, because somewhere in those weeks of watching you work and listening to you speak about books and ideas, I stopped seeing you as the woman who had humiliated me at auction and began seeing you as Eleanor, and the revenge I had planned with such cold satisfaction became impossible to imagine executing, because the thought of causing you pain felt like contemplating violence against my own heart, and when I finally remembered what I had done and realized the deadline was approaching, I spent the entire night understanding fully for the first time what kind of man I had allowed wounded pride to make me, and determining that even if you could never forgive me, I would at least ensure you never suffered for my cruelty. Eleanor stood in the morning garden, holding documents that represented the restoration of everything she had thought lost, and looking at a man who had just confessed that his feelings for her had transformed his capacity for cruelty into something that resembled redemption. And she felt the weight of weeks of fear and pretended composure lifting from her shoulders even as new uncertainty took its place, because financial salvation was one matter, but the question of what existed between them was something far more complicated and far more frightening. She set the folder carefully on the stone bench beside the rose bushes and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a small streak of dirt across her cheek. And when she spoke, her voice was steadier than she had expected it to be, given the tumult of emotion churning through her chest. You have returned my home and provided for its restoration, and I am grateful beyond any words I possess to express it adequately. But I must know whether this is restitution born of guilt, or whether there is something more beneath these grand gestures, because I cannot allow myself to hope for what cannot be if your feelings are merely the product of regret for having caused harm to someone you have come to regard as a friend. Alexander moved closer then, and reached out as though he might take her hand before stopping himself, and his grey eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch somewhere between her lungs and her throat. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like something precious and fragile. "I have spent my entire adult life believing that my title and my wealth were the only things of value I possessed, and that anyone who approached me did so out of calculation or desire for social advancement. And I armored myself in pride and cold superiority because it seemed safer to keep the world at a distance than to risk discovering I was correct in my assessment that no one could see past the Duke of Thornfield to the man who collected books because they were companionship that demanded nothing, and who had not realized until you walked into my library that he had been profoundly lonely for most of his life." She felt tears threatening again, and blinked them back, because she needed to see his face clearly, and to judge whether what she was hearing could possibly be true, or whether she was allowing desperation and her own unexpected feelings to make her believe what she wanted to believe, rather than what was real. He continued speaking, and now he did take her hand, his fingers closing around hers with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the tension visible in his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes. "This is not guilt, although I am drowning in guilt for what I did to you, and this is not restitution, although you deserve restitution and far more than I can ever provide, and this is not friendship, although I hope we might be friends among other things. And what I am trying with spectacular inelegance to say is that I have fallen entirely and irrevocably in love with you, and I am terrified that I have destroyed any possibility you might come to feel the same, because I was too proud and too foolish to recognize what was happening until I had already done you grievous harm." The words he had just spoken hung in the morning air between them like something fragile and luminous that might shatter if either of them moved too quickly or breathed too deeply, and Eleanor stood looking at Alexander's face with the leather folder of documents resting forgotten on the stone bench beside her, while her mind struggled to process what he had just confessed, because she had spent weeks believing herself to be falling in love with a man who held her future in his hands like a weapon, and who might at any moment remember his revenge and complete the destruction he had begun. But now he was telling her that he loved her, and she felt a joy so acute it was almost painful rising in her chest, even as fear whispered that perhaps this was another form of cruelty, or perhaps he was mistaken in his own feelings, or perhaps she was dreaming and would wake to find herself still trapped in the nightmare of impending loss. She realized Alexander was watching her with an expression of almost unbearable vulnerability, waiting for her to say something, and that her silence must seem like rejection to him, and she tried to find words adequate to express what she felt. But everything that came to mind seemed insufficient or trivial compared to the magnitude of what was happening between them in this sunlit garden with roses blooming and birds singing, as though the world had not just tilted on its axis and rearranged itself into an entirely new configuration. "I do not know how to answer you," she said finally, and saw him flinch, though he did not release her hands, and not because I do not have feelings for you, but because I have spent so long believing that no one could see me as anything other than the unmarried daughter past her bloom who manages her mother's failing estate, and who has nothing to recommend her but a decent education and a stubborn refusal to collapse under circumstances that would be easier to bear if I could simply surrender to them. And you are a duke, and could have any woman in England, and I cannot understand why you would choose me, except that perhaps proximity and the novelty of a woman who argues about poetry have created an illusion of feeling that will fade once you return to your normal life among people of your own rank who possess beauty and charm and all the qualities I lack. Alexander's grip on her hand tightened, and he moved closer still until she could feel the warmth of him and see the individual threads of grey in his eyes, and when he spoke his voice was rough with emotion. "Eleanor, you are the least illusory person I have ever encountered, and that is precisely why I love you, because you are entirely genuine in a world where everyone I have known has worn masks designed to hide calculation or ambition or contempt, and you have faced me with honesty, even when honesty cost you dearly, and you have maintained your dignity in circumstances that would have broken someone with less strength of character. And I do not want any woman in England. I want only you if you can possibly forgive what I did, and allow me to spend the rest of my life proving that I see exactly who you are, and that who you are is everything I never knew I needed." Eleanor found herself standing in the sunlit garden, trying to absorb what Alexander had just said to her, and feeling as though every carefully constructed wall she had built around her heart over 27 years of being overlooked and dismissed was crumbling under the weight of words she had never imagined hearing from anyone, let alone from a duke who could have chosen any woman in England, but was instead looking at her with an expression of such vulnerable hope that it made her chest ache with the enormity of what was being offered to her in this moment. She realized her hand was still clasped in his, and that she had begun crying without quite noticing when the tears had started, and she saw her own emotional chaos reflected in his face as he waited for her to speak, and she understood that he was genuinely terrified that she would reject him, and that somehow in the weeks they had spent together, arguing about books and discovering unexpected connections, he had become as vulnerable to her as she was to him. Despite all the vast differences in rank and wealth and circumstance that separated them. "I spent so many years believing I was invisible," she said, and her voice broke slightly on the words. "Not just to potential suitors, but to everyone who looked through me as though I were merely part of the furniture in whatever room I occupied, and I taught myself to find value in other things like managing the estate well and caring for my mother and reading everything I could acquire, because those were accomplishments no one could take from me, even if no one noticed them either. And then you saw me even when you were angry with me, and you argued with me as though my opinions mattered, and you gave me work that challenged my mind instead of dismissing my capabilities. And somewhere in the midst of cataloguing your impossible library, I fell in love with you too, and I have been terrified to admit it, even to myself, because loving you seemed like the cruelest form of hope, given that you held my entire future in your hands, and might at any moment remember you were supposed to be destroying me." Alexander made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and pulled her closer until there was barely any space between them, and she could feel the rapid beating of his heart through his waistcoat, and when he spoke his voice was rough with emotion that made her own tears flow faster. "Eleanor Ashworth, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, and allowing me to spend the rest of my life proving to you and to everyone who ever overlooked you that you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and that I see you completely and love everything I see, and that my greatest accomplishment will be ensuring you never doubt your worth again." She looked up at him through her tears and saw in his grey eyes a future she had never allowed herself to imagine, and a love that transformed her understanding of what was possible. And she nodded because words seemed inadequate for this moment. And then she managed to whisper, "Yes," before he kissed her there among the roses with the morning sun warming them both, and the leather folder of estate documents lying forgotten on the stone bench beside them, as Ashworth Hall witnessed the beginning of the happiness that had always belonged to its daughter, even when the world had been too blind to recognize her value.